Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Julyan Davey. Julyan is a longtime contributor to metamodern ideas, specifically around metamodern spirituality. There's a particular essay that I kind of consider pretty seminal, bit of a primer, really. It's kind of a perfect introduction. And as I've revisited it, it just becomes more and more pertinent. And anyway, I wanted to use this opportunity with Julyan to kind of dig into this essay and unpack some things and maybe go a bit deeper with the specific elements. It's called Towards a Metamodern Spirituality. And Julyan, thanks so much for being here and appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be here. It was quite a long time ago that I did the essay, and in doing my reading of it, I've sort of got re-inspired, and lots of stuff that I've been learning in the past couple of years, I feel like is built on those foundations. So I'm excited to talk about it.
That's awesome. Is there anything too that you want to throw into the mix about yourself in terms of kind of contextualizing your relationship with metamodernism, metamodern spirituality, any of that?
No, I think let's dive into the essay.
Okay. All right, great.
Get to the meat of it.
Get to the meat of it. Sure, sounds good. All right, well, cool. Well, let's just dive right in then. So you begin with kind of setting the stage for metamodernism. You talk about, what modernism is or was, what postmodernism is about, and then you introduce metamodernism. And you kind of distinctly tie that to the meta crisis and the distinct crises that are really the nature of our current cultural moment. And then you say, what would a spirituality look like that actually helped us confront the crises of our world? A spirituality that forced us to engage with the issues of our time rather than helping us to run away from them. This would be a metamodern spirituality. It would be a spirituality that would help us birth the phoenix, which is our metaphor for the world that wants to emerge from the ashes of our current collapsing and chaotic society. So that kind of, for me, was sort of setting the stage. And I don't know if there's anything up front before we get into some of the specific characteristics that you talk about as kind of being characteristic of a metamodern spirituality. But is there anything about kind of just contextualizing this within metamodernism and metamodernity that you want to dig into first?
Yeah, I was going to share a little bit about why modernist spirituality or postmodern spirituality can't really be an answer to the crisis. So modernity is the thing that's the engine that's really causing the meta crisis, I guess, and a lot of the problems that we see in the world. And so it's not going to be the solution itself, because it's coming from this mindset that is doing the damage. And there's that famous Einstein quote about, you don't solve the problem with the mindset that you create it with, or whatever.
Right.
And then postmodern approach or spirituality or whatever is also not going to be enough to solve the problem, because it's purely focused on deconstructing and tearing down the edifice. The sort of modernism built this house out of reason and science and technology, and was really excited about where the house was going, that it was going to be this beautiful house that would last forever and be filled with beautiful things and everyone would be happy. And the postmodernists take a look at the house and they see the foundations that it's built on, which maybe is colonialism and white supremacy and all of this sort of unsteady foundations of our culture, and try and rip the house down and say, this isn't a house. Why are you doing this? Look at the damage it's causing to the world. But that approach isn't enough to really build anything else. I guess a lot of your listeners are aware of metamodernism as a concept, and the really idea is, okay, we need to somehow move beyond that postmodern moment into a state where we can actually start to create again. We're not just deconstructing, we're creating a new society and a new culture, and using the criticisms of postmodernism and weaving that in with some of the vision and possibility of modernism. And I think where I've shifted a lot in the past, well, recently, is quite often I hear it described as being modernism and postmodernism, that metamodernism kind of moves back and forward between modernism and postmodernism. And I really think it's more of like this integration. It's where the modernist approach and the postmodern approach kind of come together in this whole. It's not both of them. It's a distinct new thing.
Yeah, actually, so what exactly? And it's interesting because this has been sort of a kind of theoretical debate in metamodern discussions, right? Because the initial formulation of metamodernism from the cultural theorists, the Dutch cultural theorists, Tim Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker, framed it as an oscillation back and forth. And it's been interesting to see how that framing, which is pretty, they actually go to certain pains to try to avoid, the language of, say, like dialectical synthesism, or like what's the word I'm looking for? There's the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. They, in a kind of Hegelian sense, they're like, no, it's not really quite it. It's an oscillation. But as the term has sort of been taken up by different communities that I think are really actively involved in the sorts of reconstructive efforts that you're talking about, there does seem to be a concerted sense that a kind of pushback against that framing of it, that it is a synthesis in the way that you're talking about, right? Because if you use sort of a Hegelian sense of like, there's a thesis, there's an antithesis, and the synthesis is when these two things form something new out of those earlier parts that isn't just those two things together, right? It really is a kind of new entity, which is, I think, a little bit what you were just kind of gesturing at. And I'm inclined to agree with that. I think that when metamodernism was sort of initially being framed, that there might have been a certain use for the oscillation metaphor, especially kind of in a cultural studies context. But I think other contexts have sort of, brought to the fore that that kind of dialectical element. And I think it's important, and I agree basically with that. It would be my take on it. I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about the kind of reconstructive element before we dive in, or we can just hit the different elements of the essay.
Yeah, let's get going.
Awesome. All right. So the first thing you talk about is building a proto-synthesis grand narrative. Now, this is very dear to my heart, and I would locate this within that reconstructive effort that you're kind of talking about here. As in that kind of modernist vein, there was sort of a naive sense of, based on Enlightenment principles and reason and everything like that, we'll create this, society that'll be perfect, et cetera, this kind of utopian vision. On the one hand, that was sort of that narrative. And then the postmodern critique of that is sort of, as you say, kind of going at the foundations and undermining it. And as Lyotard kind of famously suggested, that postmodernity was characterized specifically by an incredulity towards grand narratives. And so out of that kind of those parts comes this synthetic kind of third element of this proto-synthesis. There are a couple lines here I'll just read, and then let's dig in a little bit. Well, you say yourself, a key feature of postmodernism was the abandoning of all grand narratives. An overarching story of life is seen to be limiting and oppressive. Any attempt to create a grand narrative can easily be deconstructed based on its cultural and value assumptions. Postmodernism realized that many of the things we take for granted in the world around us are simply stories we tell ourselves. The metamodern move, you write, is to begin to return to grand narratives once again. We need overarching stories that show us our place in the cosmos, give us meaning in life, and help us battle the metacrisis within. So anyway, we'll say more about this sort of notion of proto-synthesis grand narrative.
So the metamodernist doesn't disagree with the postmodernist that it's all just stories, that it's all made up, that it's all a creation. They're totally in agreement with that. But their difference is they don't think that's a problem. They think that stories can be useful and powerful, and we need stories to orientate ourselves and live a meaningful life. It's almost the story that we create about reality that gives our lives meaning. And so when we've gone to this postmodern thing of tearing down all the grand narratives, we're stuck in this nihilistic, meaningless place where we don't have anything to orientate ourselves around. I think another factor in that that postmodern part is this sort of splitting up of culture and of stories. So it's almost each group is getting into a smaller and smaller story that they share in their little group and they don't share with anyone else. And there's this Jungian thing about the inner world, about differentiation and integration. So the mind becomes whole through some differentiation and some integration. And there's sort of a balance that's the flow of life, is the differentiation and integration. And if we look at the world, we can also look at the culture through that kind of lens. And if we look out there in the world, what we see is this massive differentiation. So more and more splitting. And that's really the product of the postmodernist era. It's sort of like choose your own worldview in the supermarket. And there's one worldview specifically for you or specifically for your group. And you don't really need to talk to anyone else. And the building of this proto-synthesis grand narrative is to start to do the work of integrating again. And I had this idea of we're starting the conversation. The conversation begins, which is actually communicating and trying to understand each other. I know in the game B world, they have this like rule omega and various ways of communicating. And there's a lot of the work I do is about how we can communicate with each other. How can people who are on other sides, maybe a Christian person, how can they have a dialogue with a Buddhist person and integrate, come to some shared understanding of reality? And through that kind of process of this conversation between people, cultural conversation that we need and want to happen, we can get to this place where some grand narrative has kind of emerged. And I really enjoyed reading your Wind article recently.
Thanks.
And that's a common grand narrative that people come to, especially in the metamodern world, is about complexity and self-organizing systems, and how when you look at the natural world, you see this directionality. And that's what we really go on in the next section. But maybe you want to comment on what I've said.
Well, yeah, no, I think that's a great segue into the next thing about what you also mentioned about teleology and complex systems. But let's, before we jump to that though, because I do think it ties right into this. And as you say, that essay is sort of about trying to make that move. But before kind of thinking about what the grand narratives are, I think I think just starting the piece there is important because it orients towards like the nature of at least one really important reconstructive project that needs to happen, while also articulating some of the limiting parameters, right? It's sort of like, so if there was a sort of hegemonic grand narrative or a master narrative that characterized modernity and, traditional religion before that, and to take a note from that as being like, well, there's some serious pitfalls in doing that, of just sort of like blanketly, laying over all the differences, papering them all over, and sort of like bringing everything, or attempting to bring everything towards this sort of homogeneity under a single particular idea or narrative. That's problematic, and it's hard. It's potentially destructive. It's potentially sort of silencing of difference, and it kind of forces something that it's sort of like it's almost like that you use this metaphor about like the individual psyche as having its constituent parts that kind of, the integration of those parts is sort of what leads to kind of psychic wholeness and kind of a health and salutary kind of psychology. And Layman Pascal makes this point a lot, and I find it very, very compelling and convincing about thinking about spirituality itself as being the endeavor that creates a certain surplus coherence that is analogous to what happens within the individual of parts coming together into an integrated whole, and then religion doing that sort of culturally, collectively. And that could be something we could return to with the teleology idea. But just to finish that thought, there's something dangerous about the way that this sort of grand narrative thinking occurred under traditional religion and modernity, that postmodernity in some ways attempted to correct for by sort of hyper focusing on the constituent parts and the particularization. But of course that leads to that fragmentation that you're talking about, and the breakdown of the meta narrative or the grand narrative into micro narratives, so that you lose the semblance of integration, and everything starts falling apart. Falling apart, which again is sort of a thing that we're experiencing right now. So I love the way that you're kind of framing it as the integration of those various micro narratives through discussion and discourse. Because right now there's sort of like in postmodernity and the postmodern discourse, there's such a kind of stay in your own lane kind of mentality of like, oh, you have your narrative, I'll have my narrative, and like, you can't understand my narrative because you don't have my experiences, and that sort of a thing. And it seems like there's definite limitations to that way of going about dealing with the reality of the multiplicity and the plurality of different narratives in the world, that is sort of propelled us to engage in the kind of connection and listening that you're talking about, which also kind of brings up to my ears, the idea of the listening society and all that. So to kind of funnel all that into like a question, how do we do this in the right way? And I think you're probably the perfect person to ask, because as you say, you do a whole lot of work around remediation and communication. How do we actually successfully bridge the divides that exist between narratives in a way that can respect their kind of intrinsic inherent differences, while also bringing them together into a larger order whole? That seems to be the challenge. What are your thoughts on that?
So when you were first sharing, there was a little bit about Habermas that I wanted to share that I think fits in really well, and then I can talk about the more practical stuff.
Sure.
And yeah, Habermas is someone who's inspired me a lot recently, and I know was also a big inspiration for Daniel Schmachtenberger and that kind of crew of people. And it's this really idea about, I guess he's also describing the practical part of it, of how communication kind of breaks down. So he has this idea of the life world, which is basically how we make sense of our reality. And it's the stories that we have about our world, the kind of grand narratives that we were talking about that make our lives make sense. And we have a shared life world, we share it together. And he says that that life world has been colonized. So in the same way that we went and colonized in America and Africa and all over the world, we've colonized ourselves and our own stories and cultures about the world. Like you can see it as languages dying out and local cultures dying out, as this sort of life world being degraded and our meaning kind of being stripped out of experience. And it's the life world that floods meaning into every experience that we have. And his solution to that is this thing called communicative rationality, which is basically about rationality based on communication rather than based on instrumentality, which is kind of getting something out of the rationality. And I hope that's not too high in the sky, but maybe that will send some people in that direction. It's really amazing stuff. And then the more practical thing, I guess what I wanted to say was, it's about realizing that wherever anyone is coming from, there is some truth in whatever they are saying. And they could be any of the spiral dynamic stages. Wherever they're coming from, there is something that they're holding that is important. And it's quite easy for us when we connect with someone that we're constantly trying to figure out what's wrong with their position, or how our position is better, or how they don't see the full picture. And it's almost the reverse, is to go towards the truth in whatever the person is saying and amplify that. And in nonviolent communication, there's this thing about tragic expression of needs. So I could be a violent person and I could be killing someone in the street or doing some really heinous crime. And the idea is that underneath that is some need that I'm trying to get filled, which might be my need for connection or meaning or belonging or something. And I've just created this sort of perverted way of meeting that need. And if we can go to people and speak at the level of the need of what they really care about, then we're actually able to talk to their humanity rather than talking to the defensive part of themselves that is out doing these awful things.
Yeah, it in the conversations that I've been having with John Vervaeke and Layman Pascal about the religion that's not a religion and everything, and about trying to formulate wisdom traditions through these ecologies of practices, in large part as part of this sort of reconstructive, I view it through this lens, that it's part of the reconstructive grand narrative kind of project, which, because as you note, like, it's recognized as stories, it's sort of willfully owned and appreciated as such, so that allows you to be constructive about it, and artful about it, which is kind of the key lens again for me, is sort of the artful nature in which we can construct stories that can be beneficial. In that notion of ecologies of practices, it seems like the skills that you're talking about need to be part of that. Like, we need to learn these skills, these communicative skills, as part of this ecology of practices, so that instead of people interacting with each other on the basis of difference and seeking, to find the ways in which this person doesn't align with the way I see it, and therefore I need to kind of, aggressively make my point and triumph over theirs, etc. We need to kind of flip that around, as you say, and like learn these skills which don't come naturally, I would say, or at least maybe naturally isn't the right word, but certainly not skills that we're kind of primed for through our educational kind of backgrounds. And there's a particular way of doing it. I see certain people do it very effectively, and I'm always impressed by it. That sort of leans into the yes anding rather than the contrarian factor, and it creates a sense of goodwill. And I think it is that sort of pull towards integration. So anyway, I just, within the context of grand narrative reconstruction and ecologies of practices that kind of facilitate and are part of that project, I think these communication skills are sort of vital to that enterprise. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that, or if you want to then move into the next step.
Yeah, so much to unpack. I think a key thing for me has really been starting to believe or have faith somehow that an integration is possible, that there's this idea of first principles way of thinking about it. Also, Daniel Smachterberger talks about this as well, which is the idea that you can, in any domain that you're in, you can seek out the first principles, which are the sort of bottom layer that explains how the things work. And you could kind of imagine different traditions have different words for these principles. And so in this tradition, it's called this thing, in that tradition, it's called this thing. But underneath it is some fundamental truth about how life works, what it means to be alive, and how to live a good life, so to speak. And those principles, you can have a conversation where people realize that there is a common principle between the two things that they're talking about. And through that, you can start to like bridge the gap between the people. And just seeing that that's possible is really a mind-blowing thing.
Yeah, well, actually, so to that point, because I wanted to also touch on this before we leave this topic of grand narrative reconstruction. So you write this in the piece: our metamodern spiritual grand narrative should be a synthesis of all our knowledge and understanding about the world. It should break down the centuries-old division between science and religion. But we should recognize that it's always incomplete, always ripe for updating, and we should hold it lightly as the deconstructible story that we know it is. And I find this to be really compelling to try to tie together some of these threads here, because, okay, so the notion of a grand narrative, so picking up on what you were saying about that something like this integration is possible because at the root of things there is something that we do share, however much it might be differently expressed or And I think, again, just recognizing and appreciating that is sort of part of this metamodern move in the sensibility. I think that the postmodern sensibility was much more about trying to sort of find radical alterities, right? And appreciating that, oh no, you think that you see something that kind of unites you with this other person, this other group, but that's just you projecting yourself onto them and all this sort of a thing. And so I think that we're sort of waking up to like the idea that no, we really, there are commonalities here, right? There are what Ihab Hassan calls the soft universals, and not Platonic, but empirical, and that we can work from those. And so the notion that there's some kind of shared element to the narrative here is also really interesting to me, which is where I think there's an overlap here, or at least a point of overlap with the relationship of science and religion, or the relationship of science and kind of spiritual narratives, because what I'm seeing happening is with this shift to re-engaging grand narrative thinking and synthetic thinking, there's been an emergent narrative that has come out of the sciences and empirical studies that I think can, and I hope will kind of form that shared collective basis about reality, in the sense that, okay, let me try to unpack this just a little bit. So when we operate in kind of public space, we do employ scientific understandings of reality as sort of a common basis for working with things. Which this is part of the tensions that I think have existed in postmodernity as well, right? Because okay, so you go to public school and you learn about evolution. Well, in some ways that kind of runs counter to another person's narrative, maybe if they're a creationist, let's say. And yet we still maintain that, no, we need to work from certain kind of empirical principles if we're going to be doing things in a universal public space like this. And so that means we'll be employing the kind of narratives that we're getting from the empirical sciences. And so starting from that standpoint, which I think on the whole has created a public space in which we can share a sense of the way that the world works, even as we can also recognize that not everyone necessarily will buy into that particular narrative. All that is just to kind of set up the idea that science is a potential grounding for a shared view of the world. And Greg Enriquez talks about this in his book, Unified Theory of Psychology, too, that we can have principles that unite us on that level. Now, what's interesting to me, this is the point I'm trying to make here, is that I think in the past 30 years or so, we've seen a really fascinating shift where it used to be very much that, okay, religious narratives provided a sense of, purpose, direction, value, teleology, and scientific narratives were just like, no, that doesn't exist, and there is no teleology, and there is no, any sense of kind of relative value in any of that. It's just, reductionist sort of thing. But with the introduction of these complex sciences and the introduction of new models for understanding reality based on complexity, you're beginning to see a kind of shared scientific narrative that has some elements of what used to be of great value from the religious narratives. And so that's what I'm getting at. That's what that essay about the wind was about. And so to kind of take us into the next kind of topic about teleology, that was sort of what I wanted to bring up. And so, well, yeah, why don't we just jump right into that? Because okay, so the next section that you talk about, section 2, is the return of teleology. And you write, part of this new metamodern spiritual grand narrative might include a return to teleology. You write, but with the rise of complex system science, there is the possibility for a kind of teleology to make a return. Whilst complex system science doesn't suggest that a cup wants to be a cup, the way that maybe traditional teleology would have thought about things, it does suggest that the parts of a cup self-organize in a complex system, and the overall result of that is a movement toward cupness. That's their teleology. And there are many ways in which this kind of complex systems framing of reality kind of, I think, opens up the door again to things like, yes, teleology, but then also by association value, things of that nature. So anyway, I'll stop rambling and get your thoughts on all this. But yeah, I don't know, dig into some of this this topic.
Yeah, I think the key shift is about embracing wholes. So modernistic science is about parts thinking, about breaking things into parts. And in this shift, in terms of maybe a metamodern science, we're talking about, okay, there are parts, but there are also wholes, and the wholes like level up in complexity. And for a while, I was getting really inspired by this idea called the edge of chaos, which is basically the point between order and chaos. You imagine the point just where water is about to freeze. It's a point between the chaos of the water and the order of the solidness. And you can almost see that point as being the place where life happens, where the complexity comes out of that space. And you could see that in so many domains. You could see it in spiritual domains. So there's this idea of entropic brain theory, which is a psychedelic paper by Calvin Carhart Harris, I think, which is about, okay, when you hit this point in the brain, that's when you get the psychedelic experience happens, when the brain has got too ordered, and then you shift towards this state and life happens, complexity emerges, new stuff, new thoughts happen, etc. And the same thing in the natural world. It's kind of, its normal state is flowing towards more negentropy, is what people call it, where so you've got the entropy of the universe. And then there are these little patches where more complexity emerges. And that complexity, you can kind of see it as this pattern of more complexity emerging, more cooperation emerging, and more consciousness emerging. Those are the big three that come to mind. And the evolution of life is the growth of those things, or the sort of leveling up of the wholes. So you get the next level of wholes, which has some cooperation between the wholes, between the parts, which are actually wholes, which gives you the next whole, and etc. And I guess my grand vision of that is, okay, so we're these human parts. What is it going to be like when we have a whole human community organism that is actually working, that we haven't reached yet? We haven't quite got to that point yet.
Yeah, and exactly. And that's to bring that thing back where I was talking about Layman Pascal's notion of, you know, surplus coherence, and thinking about religion as being the function of doing that, of leveling up our parts into a greater whole, through complexification and through integration. And to think about that as being the very nature of the religious sort of impulse, or the nature of the religious project. You know, like Emil Durkheim, the sociologist, wrote a book, really influential book on religion, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, talks about a collective effervescence and what people do in groups, and the sense of like ecstatic, you know, energy that kind of takes hold of people when they're collectively, you know, united and sort of oriented towards a particular thing, which could be in a ritualistic context, it could be in a protest context, it could be all these things, right? But there's a sense of like, oh, there's this energy, there's this electricity, there's this thing that's sort of transcendent. You know, I think you get this at festival context too, right? There's this transcendent sense of being more than yourself, and in a very real way, like you are, right? You're kind of like starting to plug into this thing that amongst all these different people you're doing collectively, that leads to its own new leveled up whole, which is a fascinating idea when you think about that as a religious sensibility. That is the religious sensibility, arguably, or something like that, right? Which means that the endeavor to produce a society that is more integrated and holistic, and activating through its many parts a surplus energy and directional kind of orientation and power by means of its constituent parts to create something that is more than the sum of its parts, which is to say, an emergent reality. That's a fascinating way of thinking about what it is that we mean by religion, right? And what we mean by, well, why have these grand narratives, and why think about teleology, and why do ritual and community, and but like, I've just seen a coalescence around, at least in my mind, around all these things, all these different elements that I've been studying throughout, my years of studying religion and culture and everything, of like, yes, that makes so much sense. And I think it also helps, I don't want to say secularize the notion of religion, but it helps frame the religious project in a way that I think can be a lot more palatable to a lot more people. So anyway, that was just kind of riffing on some of these things.
Yeah, I love that. And I've been really inspired by Forrest Landry's work. And he has these really specific definitions about religion and spirituality and science and things. And he talks about religion in terms of building community. It's kind of an expression out in the world that we do together to build community, which really fits with what you're saying. And the thing that really inspires me about it is that's a separate path. It's a separate sort of area of work to the science project. And they can support each other. Building community, maybe we need lots of the insights of science, but they're not in conflict. And the same with, so he has these 6 paths, which are really amazing, and which is like science and technology and spirituality and magic. And they're all separate domains of work and experience and life, and they all have their separate purpose. And for us to create a culture that really works, we need to bring all of them in.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I think that that's a really good kind of segue. Well, we don't have to leave any of the things that we're talking about, hopefully, because all these things really do intermesh and interweave with each other in really, again, kind of interesting, fascinating ways. It kind of shows this sense that, like, I don't know, I get the sense like, yes, we're really onto something here. But the next section in the essay, the third section, you talk about traversing the transcendent immanent. So I just want to throw that into the mix a little bit here. So now you say, so my way of framing this, and in fact, well, okay, let me frame this first and then I'll throw it. So there's sort of this traditional dichotomy in thinking about the world that I think frames religious worldviews is there's a transcendent plane, and then there's an immanent plane. The immanent plane is where we live. It's the mundane world. It's like it's the nature of stuff and material parts, and like this kind of physical material world. And then there was a sense of the transcendent, which in traditional grand narratives was usually part of the sort of 2 worlds mythology. There was like another world, whether that's heaven or just this sacred numinous realm that was of a fundamentally kind of different nature than the immanent world. And what you're talking about here is sort of a new sense of this traditional dichotomy that is not dualistic that way, but is actually sort of fused. Or so, as you say, so another important feature of metamodern spirituality is what is called the transcendent immanent, and then you define the immanent and the transcendent. And then you say a big part of metamodernism is moving beyond this 2-world mythology. Why? Because by setting up a bipolarity, it inherently devalues our present moment experience and denigrates the immanent realm that most of us are forced to live within. Could this denigration of the immanent partly be to blame for our uncaring attitudes towards the natural world? I think so. If things like trees are just physical, dreamlike manifestations in an immanent world that we must overcome, then why should we care for them? A metamodern spirituality will begin to see the transcendent within the immanent. It will begin to transcend into, rather than out of, a deeper and more embodied relationship with the world. And that to me is like, yes, that's, I think, so I have this whole series, it's a book, the Metamodernism and the Return of Transcendence, is about this very topic. It's kind of defining metamodernism and the metamodern sensibility shift as at least in some ways crucially bound up with that new imagination of this transcendent being within the immanent. And it's the same thing, the video series, the After Postmodernism series, it's based on that book, is that's what it's all about. So anyway, I think you expressed it beautifully. But so unpack that a little bit more. What does it mean when you say the transcendent within the immanent, that we transcend into rather than out of the world?
Or maybe I could give a little example. So if you look at any of the traditions and kind of find this pattern, or at least the axial age traditions, so like Christianity and Buddhism, etc. And I think one of the things I've realized since I wrote this essay is that if you really go deep into those traditions, that's not actually what they're saying. They're not actually saying that there is this separation between the transcendent and the immanent, but it's almost, that's how it ends up getting taught as it gets solidified into doctrine and whatever. So in Buddhism, we could talk about samsara, which is this sort of realm of form and realm of suffering. And nirvana as being a transcendent realm, something to achieve that we're not in yet. And that can give this sense of, also of nihilism. It feels like quite postmodern, really. And this sense of, okay, none of this stuff matters. And I think one of my explorations with this is, okay, if we want a spirituality that's going to face the climate crisis and is going to face the physical problems in the world and inequality and lack of democracy and everything, having a spirituality that's sort of averse to the physical immanent world is a bit of a problem. And my idea with the transcendent immanent is almost this shift into, okay, how can we find the divine in our experience? How do we bring as much divinity into our experience as possible? Which I think is exactly what the mystics were saying in any of these traditions at the beginning, and what they were talking about and experiencing and practicing. And I think one thing that's shifted also from reading Forrest Landry a lot is realizing that it's not a culture in the same way to these different paths. Like a culture needs religion and needs spirituality. A culture also needs the values of the transcendent, and it needs the values of the immanent. And Forrest also talks about the omniscient, which is a third thing. And it needs to find a balance between the values that come out of those different areas. And you could kind of see our culture as being a culture that has forgotten the transcendent and has forgotten the immanent, really, and is all of its value is coming from the omniscient. And the omniscient is about understanding the world, about science and technology, and has lost the importance of the present moment and has lost the importance of something greater being possible. And a healthy culture wants to, we could also have a culture that swung the other way, that got too obsessed with the transcendent, for example, or too obsessed with the immanent. And none of those are going to create a fully life-giving culture, because life is all of these things. Life, not just in us, but in the natural world. It's got the immanent and transcendent in it, and the omniscient in it. And that's what the flow is it's all of that stuff happening.
Yes. Well, okay, a couple things. One, I think that you make a really good point, which is that at sort of the esoteric levels of traditional religion, yes, I think that dichotomy between immanent and transcendent is transcended, actually, and that what I think it's fair to say that in the kind of exoteric forms of pedagogy and transmission and articulation of the world and the nature of the cosmos and the religious, ground of being and all that, it became this sort of dichotomy of transcendent, immanent, almost maybe as sort of a condescension for a more simplistic way of framing that, so that it's easier to hold in your mind, oh yes, we live in the vale of tears, but the world beyond. it's a lot harder to grasp, these sort of paradoxical, mystical notions that like form is emptiness and emptiness form, which I think is sort of the Buddhistic kind of framing of that, transcending the immanent and the transcendent, or, again, the Christian mystics like Eckhart and others who understood that, yeah, that these things aren't the way that simplistically they might have been taught or suggested. So I think that that's true, and I think that it can also then lead to some kind of confusion and even some frustration for people who really know a lot about traditional religions and especially esoteric practices, because it'll be like, well, wait a second, you metamodernists, this isn't anything new. In fact, I've heard that a lot. In fact, even the romantics were kind of fascinated by this, because it's arguably a perennial facet of human culture that people grok the idea that, oh yeah, like there's this really incredible, immense, majestic, sublime beyond, and then there's this thing that I'm enmeshed in, and yet somehow there's really not a separation between those things, and like that is the nature of many mystical sorts of experiences, and people have been doing that all the way back. I think that what the metamodern articulation of some of these ideas does, though, is it makes all that very explicit. And again, you might be able to argue that this has been made explicit in certain other religious traditions as well. But I think when you lay it all out up front and kind of own it and express it that way, I think, one, you're a lot less prone to, hopefully you're a lot less prone to people breaking that into this dualistic thing. And I think that at the very least, even if it's just the fact that through misunderstanding or through oversimplification, there's come to be this perceived duality between immanent and transcendent, we need a corrective for that, just pragmatically. We need to kind of throw into the mix, wait a second, it doesn't need to be expressed that way. And so again, yeah, I think that that's very much what I see in these metamodern formulations of spirituality, is understanding the transcendent as being within, or in some ways, within the immanent frame, and finding transcendence there. So anyway, that part of your essay totally, really resonated. Next part of the essay, I think we're at part 4 here. Abandoning anthropocentrism. Let me try that again. Abandoning anthropocentrism. The idea that basically human beings are, fundamentally the kind of goal and purpose of the universe. And you kind of compare this to sort of a Copernican revolution in our thinking. So talk a little bit about that, because this might I have some questions about this.
Mm-hmm. So the Copernican revolution was describing Kant and his bringing of subjectivity, kind of a switch from objectivity being at the heart to subjectivity being at the heart. And in a way that puts the human subject at the heart of, in the same way that the Copernican revolution puts the sun instead of the earth at the heart of the solar system. This is putting the subject at the heart instead of the object, which I would say is a sort of postmodern move in a way. But obviously Kant is a lot earlier than that.
Well, sorry, just real quick, actually, it's interesting. I think it's Stephen Hicks in his book, and I'm no great fan of Stephen Hicks, but his book, What is Postmodernism? He traces the origins of postmodernism all the way back to Kant, and particularly that move that you're talking about. So it's yes, he's super early. It'd be hard to call Kant a postmodernist, but the seed of postmodernism arguably is sort of there. But yeah, go on.
And by making the most important thing the human experience, there's a way when you center anything, you're devaluing everything else. And by centering the human experience, we're saying, okay, everything else is here for human experience. It's here for our subjectivity. And that sort of mindset easily leads us to exploiting the stuff around us in the way that we have been doing it for all of civilization or whatever. And it sort of supports that. And there's this sort of shift to seeing humanity as part of the more than human world, and rather than, okay, there's nature which is out there and humans which are here, there's this intertwining of things. And I think one of the the ways I now really like to talk about modern spirituality is about a return to relationship. I think this will be the section that I would add into the essay if I was going to write it now, which is about, you can kind of see each of the sections from that point of view now I think about it. And it's almost, okay, we've been out of relationship with the modern human natural world, if you want to call it that. And we want a spirituality that's going to get us back into relationship. And we've been out of relationship with ourselves because we're lonely and depressed and ill. And we've been out of relationship with the divine, with the all, with reality as a whole. And I think I like this frame because I do conflict work. And so it's almost, there's this conflict that's there with the natural world. There's this conflict with us in ourselves. And there's this conflict with divinity that we need to work through. And you know, when you have a conflict and it lasts for a really long time, it's not nice to be around. And it's almost, that's the world that we live in. It's the not niceness of these sort of blocks in the relationships that we have with life and with the parts of life. And this anthropocentrism thing, it's almost, okay, you want to heal a relationship with the natural world while saying we're the center of existence. It's sort of like trying to heal your relationship with your wife while saying, I'm the most important thing on the planet. It's probably not going to work very well.
Yeah, no, 100%. I love that too. The idea of kind of all of these things falling under the umbrella of relationship and a return to relationality, because they're all related to that as well, especially in the sense of like the dualism, subject object. You know, if I'm thinking of myself as a subjective entity just surrounded by different objects, then of course I'm objectifying everything, and then my relationship to everything becomes exploitative, pragmatic, utilitarian, rather than if we think more in terms of processes, that I'm a process, our relationship is a process, I am surrounded and part of different processes, and bring in a whole, and you gesture at this, I think, later on when you talk about an epistemic revolution and whatnot, and there's all this Whitehead that can come in here and everything, but like shifting to a process-oriented framework rather than just sort of like, yes, here's a thing and there's a thing, and the sort of deadening that can happen from that kind of objectification is also part of all this. A couple things though. One is, so there's definitely a strong kind of humanist vein that runs in my body. I think that's sort of against a certain kind of post-humanist, postmodernism that sort of like devalues humanity as being not only not all that special, but actually really destructive. And some people are actually like, you know, just completely fundamentally misanthropic about our species. And I find that to be destructive too. So I see that that's not at all what you're doing here, and I think you're making a really important point. But it's also interesting that, you know, there's a way also in which I think it's important to, while we do decenter ourselves in the way that you're talking about, there's something about the teleology that we were talking about earlier and the complexification that I think does actually lead to thinking about humanity and human ways, human subjectivity, such as it's come to be through its course of complexification, as being uniquely special as well. And I think that those things can be held simultaneously, in the sense that they're different. Not that like the world is an apex that leads to humanity or anything like that here, because on the one hand, I'm saying that this sort of complexification hypothesis and the teleology of complexification leading to deepening of consciousness, well, in that sort of process, the human brain is sort of the most complex thing that is known to exist. Actually, that's not me, that's Chazon in Cosmic Evolution, you know, a pretty kind of hardcore scientist. And so in that way, you can see a certain kind of holarchic depth related to the human subjectivity that is unique and special, and I think should be regarded as such. But then there's this other thing that you're talking about, which is de-anthropomorphization or de-anthropocentrism, that is more in the way that you're talking about. Do you see what I'm trying to parse there at all? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wrote about this a little in my most recent article, and I had this catchphrase for it. I don't know why I like these catchphrases, but finding our humanity was what came to me, which is this idea that we don't really know what humanity's place is in the village of life yet. We're these teenagers who are sort of stroppy and kicking over the can and destroying the world around us. And everyone's debating, oh, is this teenager a good teenager or a bad teenager? Is there something wrong with this teenager? The sort of the therapist, there's a family therapist who's looking at the teenager being like, oh, there's a bit of a problem, something wrong with him. And when actually it was just a growing phase, and the teenager hasn't found themselves yet. And we as humans haven't found ourselves yet. And I think that finding ourselves fits with what you're saying, which is about, okay, one of the ways you find yourself is seeing what you have naturally, what your natural gifts are. And then it's almost, okay, human beings have these natural gifts. We have complex thinking. We can be awake, and we can do things. We can make tools. We can organize. We can do things together. And those are the skills that we have. For me, we have those for a reason, and they're to give for humanity, to be a gift based on the skills that we have. And I think that doesn't need to mean that we put us any place in being any better than any other species or part of life. It's almost, we have this gift, this possibility to serve, rather than the sort of other way of thinking about it is we're better, so we deserve more than other species. Right. It's more like we're unique and we have this gift to give, and it's beautifully meaningful to give it. So why not go for it? Yeah.
No, actually, so that dovetails really well with the way that I think about this too, which is when I was reading about like regenerative permaculture, there's a notion of sort of like we can use our skills as human beings, as complex thinking people, to be shepherds of biodiversity. You know, like there's a way that regeneration and biodiversity can actually be enhanced by our abilities rather than just thoughtlessly destroyed by humanity. And I thought that was a very uplifting sort of message in terms of using our skills for good, and not sort of just denigrating our entire species based on the kind of destruction that we do. But also this point that you're making here,
can I say a little bit about
about by all means.
That's just making me think of Paul Kraffel. I'm not sure how you say his surname, Kraffel, which is someone I'd really recommend people check out. He's got this book called Seeing Nature, where he goes out on walks and he is trying to make little changes in the natural environment that boost the neg entropy.
Oh, cool.
So maybe he comes and puts a rock in a stream, and then the stream splits and goes in two directions, which means that more water gets spread out over the cliff or whatever, and more life is able to blossom. And I think that's an amazing example of a human being using our understanding and complex brains to bring more life, to allow more life to happen.
Yes, definitely. Yes. And these are the sorts of things, like the ecologies of practices could be around these sorts of things too. If we come to appreciate our ability to enhance neg entropy, to enhance complexification and biodiversity, like, again, what a beautiful notion, part of our part of a narrative that could be meaningful in a meaning crisis of like, we don't have to be destroying things. We can be actively enhancing their creativity and complexification, diversification. Yeah.
I was wondering what you think about the Christian narrative about, I can't remember how it's worded, but about the kind of caretaker, which I get the impression is something that gets criticized a lot by environmentalists and stuff, as kind of saying, oh, religion just says God has given us the earth and we can do what we want with it. And maybe what it's really saying is that maybe that's part of the human role, is this caretaker role. And bringing up, how a good teacher sort of brings up the students, or raises up everyone else. A good leader, I guess, raises everyone else up and brings them more into themselves and more allows them to more fully express who they are. It's almost, that's the human role in the ecosystem, is to allow, to be this leader who allows everything else to flourish.
Yeah, 100%. I think that is the idea of the gardener, right? I mean, and gardens are all about that, especially, organic and gardens based on permaculture ideas, where you're bringing these things together, using, like, because there's this notion, and it's a misleading one, I think, that some people have, that, oh, well, if human beings weren't around, everything would just be better. Like, whatever is natural is good. And I can understand a lot of that, but I think there's a much richer and more compelling way of seeing it, that nature has processes, and certain conditions can aid or hinder those complexification processes, and that as human beings with complex brains that are aware and able to make decisions and have tactile sensibilities that can, we're highly dexterous and all that, we can help create conditions for flourishing. And of course, then when the biosphere is flourishing, then human culture, flourishes on top of that stack. So for me, I think of the garden metaphor as being sort of all about that idea, and the degree to which that idea could be implemented in Christian circles through the notion of stewardship, which is what you're referring to, the notion of being good stewards. That's great to me, whether or not kind of in a kind of exegetical sense, if you look at the text, is that, kind of the original meaning? Well, that's a bit of a stretch, but again, it's sort of like, we need stories. And if that's a story that works to kind of bring that out, then, yeah, I'm all for that. Yeah. So the next section here, which again is weaving a bunch of these things together now, is titled Healing the Wound of Dualism. And we've already been talking about these various dualisms and dichotomies. You mentioned, the dominant version of the two worlds mythology that separates transcendence and immanence. But we've been talking about a whole bunch of other things as well. So yeah, talk about that as being a function or a characteristic of metamodern spirituality.
Yeah, so you could see this dualism between the subject and the object as being another two worlds mythology. It's one of the two worlds mythology, and it's really at the heart of, a lot of people have said this, but really at the heart of Western thinking and Enlightenment and Descartes and all of that. And you could see how modernist and postmodernist approaches, they focus on one end of the duality. So the modernist is focused on objectivity, on understanding the world out there, the things and the parts of things in the world out there, putting them together, understanding them through science and putting them together into technology to make a better world. That's the proposal of the modernist. And the postmodernist is really rejecting that. And instead of focusing on the objective world, is focusing on the subjective world. And if you read a lot of postmodern literature, it's all about subjectivity, which fits with that Kant thing that we were talking about. And the metamodern shift is really about relationship. It's, okay, there's this third thing. There's not actually two things, there's actually three things. And the third thing is the relationship between the subject and the object. And they're always in relationship, and there's some stuff that's coming from the subjectivity and some stuff that's coming from objectivity. And our experience is the child of that relationship. And there's someone called Karen Barad, who's written a really amazing book tying feminism and quantum physics and a lot of this metaphysical stuff. There's someone I would recommend. And I guess it's also tying in with quantum understandings, where it's how we view reality and what reality is like intertwined with each other. They're not two, it's not a separate thing. How we look at something affects what it is there. And it's almost, I think this fits back in the protosynthesis grand narrative part, where it's like, okay, we're doing this science and it's kind of confirming this metaphysical way of thinking about things. And that's getting this, the proto-synthesis is sort of, oh yeah, maybe there's something here. And I talk about it in the essay in various other ways. There's like the having and the being modes of Irving Yalom. So you can talk about it from that perspective. You can talk about it about Dasein, which is Heidegger's concept. And I think they're all pointing to the same thing, really. And I think a lot of my more recent work has been saying, okay, why do we create this dualistic way of seeing things? And it's almost because we think that there's something wrong in our experience. And so we need to, we habitually judge experience in some way and create a dualism of good and bad, or of this is okay, this isn't okay. And if we stay with our experience of a particular thing, it sort of unfolds and produces its beauty.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts. One is okay, so yeah. So a couple thoughts. You mentioned the having versus being mode. You also mentioned the transjective notion, which I get from Vervaeke. I'm not sure if that's where you're getting that too. In fact, I'm not sure if he even coined that phrase. I think he might have, or maybe it was already one that he's just using. But again, as I'm going through this, you'll make me think of something and be like, oh, that sounds something like something, that Vervaeke was saying. And I'd be, oh, no, there you go. Like you got the transjective in there. So it's like, this essay is just really great because it kind of weaves all these things together really nicely. But this whole thing about subject object and whatnot is intriguing to me, deeply intriguing, actually. In fact, I'm kind of considering, I'm kind of plotting this book around looking at all of these issues through the lens of subject versus object relationships, because everything kind of seems to keep coming back to that. But the way that we kind of cause this wound of dualism to kind of keep occurring, and then all the negative consequences that come from that, seems to me to lead again to the importance of spiritual practice and something like meditation, right? Where you're sort of taking those sorts of dichotomies into your awareness and kind of interrogating them, maybe even, transcending them. And so there tends to be in a certain line of critique against, spiritual frameworks that are less focused on systems change and ethics and helping people in the world, and seem to be more focused on things like meditation and kind of awakening experiences. And yet, in my mind, they're kind of intimately bound up for just this sort of reason, right? That if we're walking around in the world as individuals with a kind of broken notion about what we think of as being subjects and objects and how we treat those things consequently, like you get enough of that going on, you're going to have a broken world. And so, the only place to kind of heal that wound, that dualistic wound between subject and object, is going to include the subject, right? And there's got to be a subjective component of like transcending that limited view. And things like meditation are sort of, meant to facilitate that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, like where the subject object transcendence is bound up with certain spiritual practices and whatnot.
Yeah, I want to come back to talking about it in terms of relationship, because you could almost see the dualistic thinking as being the block in these relationships that I've been talking about. It's when we get into thinking in a dualistic way in our relationship with each other, that creates this block where life can't flow through us. The process of life, of the evolution of consciousness and cooperation, can't move. The dualistic thinking is the stuck bit of coal in the river. And totally, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the other section, which is inner work for global political transformation, because I think it fits really tightly together, which is if you notice some of the problems in the world and you see this need for system change, and then you go out and do that, but you're doing that coming from the same dualistic mindset, perspective, way of being, then anything you create is going to be coming from that mindset as well. And I think you can kind of tell when someone is coming from that mindset. Whenever they're in judgment, they're saying that something is wrong or bad, and they have this energy of negation, of rejection in them, that's when they're fundamentally in a dualistic mode. When they're connected to value, so they're saying, oh, wouldn't it be great if the world could be like this? I really care about these trees. I want to protect these trees. They're not saying that anything is wrong with the outside world or with their experience. They're not going into dualistic thinking. They're an expression of life, an expression of care for something, an expression of love. And it's only by working our way through the blocks inside of ourselves, kind of healing that relationship with ourselves, that we can do wise political action, where we can actually transform the outside world. And I think I've had this insight and been developing it for a long time about just the interconnection between inner work and outer work, and how, people get lost in pure inner work and people get lost in pure outer work, and the two need each other. In the same way we were talking about science and religion as being these separate paths that support each other. It's totally the same thing. They're different domains, and you can't do one successfully without the other. And I think, so recently I've had this idea in the last few days about the terrors. So you've got the outer terror, the outer work terror, which is we live in a collapsing civilization. Climate change is real and going to cause a lot of suffering and maybe the collapse of our Western world. And when you realize that and you look at different reports about it, it's this terror. It's like a horror in the outer world. And you want to do something about it. And when you try and do something about it, if you're honest with yourself, you'll probably realize the inner terror, which is there's not just the terror in the outside world, but there's a terror inside, which is the realization that you're out of control, that you make this intention for the new year to do all this great work, to do this activism, and you can't actually do it. You want to come from the place of love and express that in the world, but you end up being judgmental and hating people and pissing off your friends and your partner, and you do things that you know you don't actually want to do. And realizing that is this inner terror. And I think the people who we need to confront the meta crisis are the people who've seen both the terrors. If you've only seen one of the terrors, it's not enough. You need to have seen both, because it's only through seeing the inner terror that you can have compassion for the people. And it's only through seeing the outer terror that you're actually going to be able to do anything about the meta crisis, or like change the physical world out there.
Yeah. I mean, and part of that, the inner terror is like, I just saw this quote and I forget who said it. I'll put it, in here, but it was something like, most of the world's problems could be solved if people could learn to sit in a room by themselves for like an extended period of time. Because like the inner terror is, right, you're sitting there, you're not occupied, you're not distracted. So what do? You reach for your phone, right? You reach for distraction. You need preoccupation, because just to like sit with your own subjectivity is like it can be a terror, or at least oppressive in some way. And so people are always sort of looking outside of themselves to kind of like, not the ecstasis of ecstasy, but the ecstasis of distraction. And it's like, okay, and it's interesting because it's those kind of compulsive, distractive behaviors then lead to the world that we get, right? Of like, oh, okay, I can't just sit by myself and like think what's going on inside of me. That's okay, I've got to be on Facebook, let me buy a new thing, right? Let me plan a trip, and then it's just like this endless goes on, and then it's like, oh, and then oh no, now we're ruining the world, and now the terror is out there, but I can't, and then you're kind of stuck between two terrors. And the way that I look at all this is that like this is the crucial component that I think metamodern spirituality brings to the crisis, right? It's like we have, as Vervaeke will say, like we know where to get knowledge, but where do you get wisdom? Like we have a cognitive capacity that that doesn't need help by and large, right? But new technologies are coming online every day, and like this stuff is being made. Incredible things are being done with, it takes a capacity of thinking and complexity of knowledge that is boggling. We got that, but then it's like, what do we do about all this other stuff, the interpersonal stuff, the dealing with that inner terror, right? And like, we've got to be able to bring these things into alignment so that our kind of mental abilities is more in line with our psychosocial, spiritual abilities. That's, at least for me, why I think is like so crucial about this terrain of like, okay, well then what are those things that we need to bring up to speed to match our, just exponentially increasing kind of cognitive complexity and technology, which again is kind of a big part of that essay, The Wind. But another thing that you're bringing out is like the whole notion of the transpersonal, right? That it's like the dualistic thinking of like, well, I'm a me and you're a you, and like, maybe we have shared interests or maybe we don't, and all that sort of thing. That blockage is what stops a kind of appreciation for our transpersonal connection and inner kind of relationship of these sorts of things, and that we need to be able to expand our awareness of like what we're focusing on. As long as I'm just focusing on myself and how things relate to me, and can't get a bigger vantage on like the rest of how these things interrelate, the relationship component of this, then we're in serious trouble. I was just thinking of, I was driving by somewhere and someone said, oh yeah, that used to be, like a public park, forest park, but then they tore it down and made a development. And then they very sincerely said, but don't worry, they put a new forest in somewhere else to, so it kind of was all even in the wash, right? And what struck me about that was that the presumption that you could just create a forest somewhere, right, without having any understanding of like the deep root structures and like the deep ecological relationships that only develop through long periods of time and that sort of a thing. There's just this notion of like, oh well, we can just do that over here. And to me, that just bespeaks a general limitation in being able to appreciate, what lies below the surface of things that doesn't immediately seem applicable to us, right? Like we want a housing development here, so that makes sense. But like, what are we not seeing? What do we not look at because it's just not part of our ken? And that's the expansion of kind of, conscious awareness that I think we need. But anyway, so what you're saying, this is just bringing all this up for me. So I don't know.
I love it. I think the thing that ties a lot of this together for me is about creating a wisdom culture. Maybe that fits really with the stuff Viveki, was it Viveki talking about that? And so we need these ecosystem of practices for me to create a culture that contains or holds the wisdom of how to live in harmony with life. And I have this story about elders, and there's this amazing book by Malidoma Somé, where he's talking about the elders in his community. I think it's in Burkina Faso. And these are the people who, when someone they call it going private, which is where someone in the community kind of rejects the community and starts trying to get profit for themselves, which is sort of what our civilization is about. Everyone rejecting community life and going alone. And the elders are there holding the wisdom of how to live and what it means to live in harmony with life, seeing that this person isn't living in harmony with life, and then bringing them back into the fold, or finding some way to coax them, to support them, to see that what they're doing is harming themselves as well. Mm. And you could see the grand narrative that we were talking about earlier. That wants to be a grand narrative that it's a wisdom, it's imbued with wisdom. And you imagine these old stories of indigenous cultures and stuff where the stories are communicating how to live in harmony with life. And they're wisdom stories. And our grand narrative wants to have that, wants to have the principles. That's where we go back to the principles thing, where it's like, okay, the principles are how do we live in harmony with life? And then we put those principles into a story and we follow that story and we share that story, and it's always changing and there's a never ending evolving thing. And we have ways to bring up children that bring them into the wisdom culture so that they're also holding the principles of how to live in harmony with life. And there are things like adulthood initiations that support them in getting the wisdom they need to be a functioning member of humanity, so that they can take up their place in the humanity, which is a contribution to the wider thing. And it's all these levels. And it's almost, how can humanity learn to live in harmony with life again, with all of our new technology and new science? It's almost, okay, we could maybe do that. Maybe it's a debatable thing, but people could say, okay, maybe we could do that before. And now we've got all this new stuff. And how do we now move to a place where, okay, we've got the wisdom and we've got the science and technology, and we're using it as part of our gift back to life?
Exactly. 100%. I think that nails it on the head. I think the cultivation, the formation and cultivation of that wisdom society, the wisdom civilization, is really kind of the grand project of the grand narrative of metamodern spirituality, which needs to be rooted in the real complexification of the world, which arguably is one of the crucial things that modern narrative lost. It's just this kind of simplistic, oh, this box fits here, this box fits here, and now we're all good. But now it's like, oh wait, that box has like deep roots, and that those roots form through eons of time. And it's just this like, oh yeah, you can't just move these things around. Things are a lot more, they're just deeper, they're more complex, they're more interrelated than we ever kind of initially thought. And now we've got to kind of level up again, where that understanding kind of forms the foundation, I would say. But we've gotten through about half of this essay. I'd love to meet again and kind of go through the rest. So if you'd be down for that, that'd be a lot of fun. Just because, time being what it is.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Awesome. Cool, man. Well, hey, Julyan, Davey, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. And next time we'll go through the rest and kind of keep riffing on the materials in there and kind of lay it all out. So until then, my friend, much love. Take care.
Thank you so much.
We'll talk to you later.
See you soon.
Bye.